I have the great pleasure to welcome George Wessner, who is the research professor at Georgetown University. Welcome, Professor Wessner.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be with you.
So I would like to have some first questions about your role and implication on entrepreneurship policy. And you have been advising governments, parliaments, the UN or universities and leaders all over the world for many years now. And we would like to have more about your insights on the importance of innovation and entrepreneurship to help build better policies. So tell us more about your observation, and probably you have any recommendations.
Well, the recommendations depend very much on the individual national or regional context. But I think one of the main things that has happened is there's been a steadily growing interest in entrepreneurship. And as you may know, my program at the National Academy of Sciences was one of the first to start talking about innovation ecosystems as distinct from Professor Nelson and others' work on national innovation systems. That's a conceptual difference that's important because at the National Academy of Sciences, we also was the Academy of Engineering and Medicine, but there was a tendency in the economics profession to think of an innovation system as kind of like a bridge where all the parts would fit together and you knew where you were starting and where you were going to end. And the ecosystem concept captures the dynamic element. It's also important to remember that these systems, whether the innovation system or the ecosystem, were never designed by a group of government officials sitting down and saying, now we're going to build an innovation ecosystem. It's something that grew up in a very ad hoc, bottoms-up approach. It's simply the way they are. Ours was transformed in the United States by World War II. That's ancient history to many people today, but they forget that, it's the results of that global conflict which shaped the modern university in the United States. It's also why we're speaking English and not German or some other language. So it's been that profound historical cataclysm lives on. And then, of course, the Cold War. One of the main lessons out of World War II was the importance of science for economic and military strength, and the Cold War then reemphasized that. The fact that the Russians today call their new vaccine Sputnik is not an accident. That was a triumph of their science and a very rude shock to the United States. One of the results was the creation first of DARPA and then of the NASA, National Aeronautics and Space Administration. Again, that may seem like history, but nothing has been more powerful than DARPA in shaping modern technology. And indeed, they were responsible for early investments in the messenger technology for the vaccines. They worked very closely with Moderna to not just support the science, which NIH had been doing, but to drive it to a product fast. There was an article in the Washington Post about the NIH would check in every 3 months on you, and DARPA was checking every week, and then at the height of the crisis, once a day to see how Moderna was advancing, which resulted in this remarkable achievement that surpassed even the celebrated Fauci as the head of NIAID, the National Institute of Allergies and Infectious Diseases, that we produced a vaccine much faster than he thought he could, and the world is benefiting from it. It also, the vaccine process emphasizes some other factors. You had a group of Turks, or some brilliant scientists, Turkish scientists living in Germany and cooperating with another organization in the United Kingdom, which has resulted in another very effective vaccine. And it's that kind of international collaboration, which has certainly was not really characteristic in products in the pre-war. You did have it's worth keeping in mind, in the 30s, Germany and the United Kingdom really led the world in scientific achievement, and much of what the U.S. was doing was catch up. Another point from an innovation perspective is that one of the jokes I like to make is, if you want to have innovation, then you have to innovate, both at the micro level, but importantly at the institutional level. And the creation of DARPA and NASA, which is why I mentioned it, were new institutions which were designed to bring things together in new ways. And DARPA was particularly remarkable for its willingness to accept risk. NASA had a charge ahead strategy, which was emphasized under some of the administrators, and some of the big disasters were caused by an unwillingness to, or a willingness to accept more risk than the engineers advised. There was a big study by the National Academy of Sciences for the first disaster in the space program, and sadly, its conclusion was the rubber connectors get hard when it's too cold, and so it blew up. The broader picture is that there's been this growing awareness of innovation, and then the program I had at the academies, that I established academies, was technology, innovation, and entrepreneurship. And those three facets are all linked. Many of our European colleagues are often quite good in generating new technologies or ideas that can lead to new technologies. But the innovation process and it's bringing that idea to market, and the entrepreneurial skills, but also the entrepreneurial incentives. The French sometimes talk about the lack of entrepreneurial spirit. There's plenty of spirit. They've all moved to Boston and Silicon Valley. I mean, quite literally. I think there's something like 89,000 French living in New York, and a much larger number living in California, particularly in the Valley. So they're excellent engineers, and they go where you can do things. The common European dilemma is that establishing security for workers can make it hard to have the new jobs and the new products that Europe desperately needs in order to compete. But the focus has shifted. I went from talking to the members of the French Parliament, a Professor Du Bernard, who was a polyvant. He was one of the men who first replaced forgive the expression, replaced the face of a woman who had been attacked by a dog. And it was one of the first major transformations doing that. But he was also extremely interested in innovation policy, and played a key role in developing some of the current French legislation from the 2000s. But he, unlike many, was willing to sit down with a group of American specialists and ask them questions and take notes. Very often you have the impression that, well, at least among some of the elites in France, that everything is already known, and they know it. And then there are often very complicated explanations as to why that's not actualized in products and competitiveness. keeping in mind that top French firms are extremely competitive, and their science base, their educational system is generates much of the mathematical talent that goes to London. So,
Exactly.
anyhow, the broader picture is a rising sense of understanding the importance of innovation and entrepreneurship, rising changes institutionally, great progress made across Europe in a number of educational institutions that I think are underreported. You have Cambridge, of course, a star, but you have TUM in Munich, and you have the Catholic University of Leuven, strangely enough, in Leuven, and you have universities like Jönköping and in Gothenburg that are, not to mention the Stockholm network, that are all very capable of competing on an international basis. On the other hand, I remember talking to an official in Malaga, and they were saying that this was the Silicon Valley in Europe, and they were pointing to all the reality of all these large tech firms that were established there. But then I asked, well, that's fine. Where's Stanford? And the University of Malaga is a very reputable institution, but it's perhaps not Stanford. And one of the challenges politically is the Germans have encountered is with their excellence program is reinforcing success, concentrating resources. I think actually the French may be better at that de facto than our German colleagues. When the majority of the universities are all centers of excellence, well, then you have to look at your center of what that means. In any case, it's also important to keep in mind that while some of the innovation coming out of the States is remarkable, that you have to look where it's manufactured. The Germans have excelled in their focus, particularly through the Fraunhofer Institutes, although those are, I think that's changing, but generally they're less dynamic, but they do enable traditional industries to compete. And traditional industries, it's important for those of us in the innovation space to recognize that they employ a lot of people, and some of your best super startup don't. They may be, the numbers of people that work at Google are well, perhaps brilliant, are really quite limited compared to a large manufacturing plant. In any case, so the focus has shifted happily. There's a recognition of the importance of working on innovation policy. Mm-hmm. As I was joking with you before we went on video, it's to reiterate that people recognize we have to face up to the global competitiveness challenge, and the joke is they're willing to do whatever is necessary as long as nothing changes. And that's that I think is the Western European and to some extent the U.S. Challenge. One thing that has shifted, that was integral to my work, is the recognition of government industry university partnerships as essential to U.S. success in the past. But now there's more public recognition that policy recognition that they need to be pursued. And both in Europe and the U.S., just in the last 3-4 years, as a result of the Chinese challenge, have recognized that efforts to constrain state support for high-tech industry is perhaps not a good plan. And there's been a radical shift. We'll see how it works through in the United States, where efforts to help U.S. chip companies are really quite dramatic. That hasn't happened since the formation of Sematech in 1987. And what we still don't have is one of the keys to the we could talk about that at length, but one of the keys to the success of Sematech is that there were trade measures that that stopped the dumping, which is going to drive companies like Intel out of business. Economists traditionally don't like to address these things because it violates traditional trade theory. And that dogma, because it is a dogma, is in the hands of the commission and others has, I think, hindered our ability to compete with what Robert Wade described years ago as the Asian industrial model, that had with Korea, Singapore, Taiwan, and now China. I'm sorry, I left Japan out, which was the initial leader of the model. But the challenge with China, of course, is scale. Singapore may be an effective competitor, but they're not threatening the international system, and that's probably not true for China. In any case, that's just a quick overview, but the institutional component, I haven't talked about the direct incentives for entrepreneurs, but you've asked a question which is a vast subject. The broader answer is that there's much more receptivity, I think, in parliaments in Europe and the American Congress, remarkably enough. Efforts for the chip industry are bipartisan, and there's that wonderful quote that we have the Jeffersonians who believe in the open markets and a limited role for government, and we have the Hamiltonians who believe in direct subsidies and intervention in the market. And over the 200 plus years of American history, by and large, the Jeffersonians have won the rhetorical contest, and the practice on good days has been Hamiltonian. People say we don't have industrial policy in the U.S. Well, I think it was in 1871 or thereabouts, we set up the Department of Agriculture, which works on agriculture. And we have become a powerhouse in agriculture in no small part because of that. In any case, I'll stop there. If that, as you may detect, I can go on.
Thank you very much. This is very inspiring also to do this historical perspective, because when we see what was happening before, we can see also where we're going and probably what we can recommend or preconize. And also this broad global view and perspective with different countries, different policies, innovation policies. You have highlighted also the importance about the dynamic nature of these policies, but also the governments, about the top-down and bottom-up probably discussions as best practices. You have also raised the importance of infrastructure and the different tools. I was wondering if you can see in the evolution perspective from remaining still in a global and broad perspective, have you seen in the different countries probably some trends about innovation? Is it all the countries focused on how to reproduce the Silicon Valley success, or have you seen today some trends appearing about the innovation policy, and probably have you identified from a critical point of view what it works, what it doesn't work, or twist?
Those are very broad questions. They're good questions, but there is this focus on Silicon Valley, and the joke is that the only region in the world not trying to become Silicon Valley is Silicon Valley, because they continue to evolve with multiple ecosystems overlaid, which is some of the richness that you can get there. You also have so in the best case, emulating Silicon Valley or elements of it, it can be a very powerful lesson. The problem is that in Europe and to some extent in Asia, there's often a fixation on venture capital as the key. It's extremely important, but it's not the only thing. It's venture capital provides resources for scaling, which is one of the successes of the U.S. innovation system, but one that China has been able to emulate very effectively. You have top-level high-tech firms, particularly in social media and other in China, in Russia, in the U.S., in India, and in Europe. You have regulators and a focus on governance, which has some advantages. I am so relieved that every time I go onto a site, I have to press I accept so I can get on with my work. Because before, I didn't know what was going to happen. And now, of course, I don't know what's going to happen. And our ability to control that is actually, in the end, quite limited, for both by the process itself but also by the ability of state oversight actors, or including our own governments, or nefarious actors to, we're not alone on the screen. So forgive me, I digress there, but there's been quite uneven ability to repeat some of the attributes of Silicon Valley or of the U.S. innovation system. One of the ones that I personally have had considerable success in talking about, and Luc Soute once, forgive me, it's a little self-serving, but once made me the compliment that you're not just describing how the American system works, you're actually advocating that some of those programs be adopted by other countries. And he said that was daring. I hope not rude, but of course necessary. And I work with some of the outstanding technology institutions like Vinnova in Sweden. And the program I'm talking about, of course, is the SBIR program, SPEAR. And it has often provided funds for small companies before venture capitalists would consider investing in them. In fact, one of the jokes is that I asked venture capitalist once what he thought of SPEAR, and he said, "Oh, it takes too long. It's too bureaucratic, and the money is too small." And I said, "Well, do any of your startup companies have SPEARs?" He said, "Well, I think we have 14." It's undiluted capital, and the program has expanded. It's now a starting fee of around $250,000 for proof of concept, but then 1, 2, and sometimes many more million, depending on the agency. Defense, of course, has the procurement funds to complement when they want. But they work hard at in fact, ironically, one of the advantages of the program is that it can reveal dry holes early, fail early, fail cheaply. And sometimes projects, because it is project-based, seem to be failures. They're actually instructive failures that let you lead on to other programs. And some academics have made some facile critiques of the program. There's phase 1, but there was no phase 2, so it's a failure. Well, no, they got equity from other sources immediately after phase 1, or they were purchased, or they accomplished what the Navy needed for $250,000. And one of the questions that is often left out is, well, compared to what? That, I would suggest, for your work in innovation policy is extremely important. The venture guys, they're seed capital firms, but they're cautious, and if not cautious, they lose a lot of money. Pairing the advantage of SBR, it in effect represents 2 rounds of due diligence to get to a phase 2. And at least on the defense side, which is over half the program, there's a ready market. You know, the Defense Department doesn't fund scientifically interesting projects. They fund things they may need to buy. And sometimes that's very banal, and sometimes it's quite important.
It's extremely interesting also what you identify also about, there's a lot of focus about funding and have venture capital, but what you have raised is that we have to fill all the support chains, and before probably to fill before when you create the company and after. And the second view is that there is a diversity of factors and and rules and all this complexity in a system. But also you raised a very important point about embrace the failure, and from the failure we can learn, and we can see probably is an entrepreneurial culture, to build an entrepreneurial culture that we cannot see probably in some countries, that we have to have a visionary leaders and governance to see. Do you identify other probably enablers for a company to improve its innovation capacity and build like that a successful innovation system? Whether enablers or even if you should start, if you want to create an efficient innovation system and policy, from where you should start or where to invest, where to define the pillars for an successful innovation policy?
Well, having multiple sources of early stage finance, either centrally funded. I mean, I'm very pleased the European Commission has adopted the SME instrument, which I understand is being revisited again. You know, one of the reasons for the success of SBR in the US is that we created it in '82, and it kept growing, partly by not a conscious policy process, but by pressure from the small business community. But we left it in place, and it was renewed on 7-year cycles for the most part, and it had no budget line, which was crucial to its existence, because that meant the conservative government could remember in George Bush's administration, the second George Bush, they wanted, some of the eager acolytes wanted to cut the SBR program because it was interference in the operation of the market, and you know, the straight dogma, and they wanted to find its budget, and they were dismayed to find out that to cut the SBR program, you'd have to cut the Defense Department budget, because it's a percentage of their research budget. So not having that line, that budget line, it just kept going. And of course, getting rid of the entire act meant they had to take on the small business community. And that was something that people who cared less about dogma and more about re-election understood. So, and not to mention that the program itself had, you know, has had very, very strong results. In fact, it's underappreciated. As someone famously said, that there is no SBIR shrine when you go into a modern company where you clap your hands and thank your forebears. It's companies. Even when I was working on the program, many people were unaware that, you know, Qualcomm, Symantec, the electric toothbrush, you know, LASIK eye surgery are all SBI awards, and the Qualcomm is, of course, absolutely huge. The government was willing to finance Qualcomm research into the compression technologies that underpin our whole system of mobile telecommunications. And it's a little bit like DARPA. One of their approaches was that people were arguing that doing what Qualcomm was trying to do with signal transmissions was not within the laws of physics. Fortunately, there were some officials with knowledge, by the way, with technical knowledge in the military, who said, well, they didn't say this, but the apocryphal is, well, it may be not within the laws of physics, but if it worked, it would be really good. So you take a flyer, you give them some money and see if they can do it. And as you said, sometimes it doesn't work, but you pick yourself up, dust yourself off, and go again. And it's also a very important part of the program is it's large enough that there's a portfolio. That doesn't mean that every country that wants to adopt it needs billions of dollars. You just need to be consistent, have a rigorous selection process, a rigorous evaluation process, drawing on the private sector, and for that process. And stop what isn't working and reinforce what is, or put the money out again, see if someone else can do it. In any case, I'm sorry, I've lost the thread of your questions there, which are broad enough for several hours of seminar. But I think the learning, the institutional innovation, adoption of other countries' programs, we are essentially, both Europe and the US, beginning to adopt China's approach, which is to provide substantial public capital for valued companies. And the hard thing to understand is that these are, in most cases, extremely successful companies. It's just the technology. You know, the cost of a modern fab is approaching $15 billion, depending on the type of equipment and so on. And TSMC, well, it's a fine company, and it's certainly a very fine country, if we're allowed to say that these days. But they are producing something like 92% of the most advanced chips. And aside from the geopolitical challenge of Taiwan and China, Micron has been having trouble producing chips because there's not enough water because of climate change. And as we tend to forget, Taiwan sits on, the Great Rim of Fire. And in 2002, I think, there was an earthquake, and there will once again be an earthquake. So having much of the world's semiconductor ecosystem at a single point of failure is ill-advised, quite apart from Chinese competition or anything else. You just can't do that. I should say, as part of this, I have a new book out on the development of the ecosystem in upstate New York, how they became a very powerful regional nanotechnology center as a result of state investments. In fact, it's a much better model than Silicon Valley, not in terms of complexity and achievement, but just, if you start out from a low base and you want to grow, the Albany model is a very powerful one that involves sustained leadership, as I was mentioning. Governors from both parties kept the investments going. Entrepreneurial leadership by a man named Alan Kalineros, no surprise, a Greek who was not only an excellent physicist, but someone who understood the importance of nanotechnologies for the future and was a deal maker. There was also lessons on the structure of the universities. Again, there was institutional innovation, consistency, large-scale funding, great opposition from the traditionalists in the community. How dare the state university become larger and more important in Washington than our other distinguished universities, I would add. but they were also places like RPI and smaller university or colleges like Union were generating top quality personnel who could serve the system. But there you get into immigration policy as well, because about half, this is where, if you don't know, this is where the College of Nanoscale Science and Engineering is, and part of SUNY Polytech, and it's also where Global Foundries is located. Just last week, there was a sweet, resounding success, particularly if you've got a book out on it, that they're going to build another fab, which will be another massive investment requiring state aid. That is one of the secrets in the U.S., that much of our aid to business comes at the state level. Although there's, definitions of aid. There are grants, which is aid. There is also, tax forgiveness, which means we're not going to take money from you that we might otherwise take from you, which is not exactly a grant. But if you're importing equipment that runs over $100 million a piece, paying a 15% tax on that, it can be prohibitive. In any case, that's be happy to talk to you another time about that whole.
Great. So we keep this points and comments, and we'll also link the complementarity and the geography of the places. Thank you very much for sharing today all these inspiring insights about and precious advice also about building better innovation policies in different places in the world, and sharing with us all this broad and comparative story from different places. So I would like to thank you again, Professor Wessner, and I wish you a great day.
Thank you. Thanks very much. Goodbye.